Without any further ado, I will give the floor to the moderator for this session. And yeah, I think from there we can continue. Thank you very much, Maria. I'm giving you the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this ACCA First webinar. As for few housekeeping announcements before I list the name of our panelists. On today's webinars, we'll have polls, the first and second one. The first one will be put on the screen. We encourage participants to fill in the poll to enable the Secretariat also to know what has been our expectations and how those expectations could have been met. And the other thing is also to use the chat rooms to react on presentations as the participant will be proceeding with their presentation. Also any questions, also we encourage the chat room to be utilized. On the other note, we have interpreters with us who will be translating in French and English. So you are able to follow that underneath your screen to select which language is more convenient for you to use and to react accordingly. And on the same note, we will also request the possibility of our participants to speak slowly so that interpreters could be able to follow and everyone else within the webinar today could be react, could be follow and engage in the conversations. And I would now wish to introduce the panelists. We are thankful for their acknowledging to be with us today, and also ACCA participants who you are the members of this organization. So we thank you for your time and willingness. The first poll is on the screen. Kindly, we are requesting you to react. For our panelists, we'll have between 10 and 15 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll set aside 30 to 40 minutes for questions and follow-up from participants, and then we'll react with maybe brief issues which will be raising according to how those questions and suggestions will be coming up after the presentations. But also before we finish our webinar today, I'll also invite again Benjamin from ACCA Secretariat to speak few words before we close off the webinar. So now, without further ado, I'll introduce the panelists. The first one that we're having with us today, thank you, is Professor Jing Zhang. For those who were with us in the ACCA GA, where there, remember that he is a founder and ED of China Accountability Project and a lecturer in law at University of Maryland School of Law. She'll be sharing with us today the Fighting COVID-19, China in Action, preliminary remarks on China response to COVID-19 and its potential impact on Chinese investment in Africa. Professor Jing will be followed by Dr. Sean Shi, who will come in to speak about the issues of mutual aid and workers in China during COVID-19 and the implication of Chinese investment in Africa and Asia. Dr. Sean is a founder of Social Innovation Advisory and also a researcher fellow at Chinese University of Hong Kong and Right Collab contributor. And with us again, we have Mr. Umo Isua Iku, working for he's a coordinator for Peace Point Development Foundation based in Nigeria. Mr. Umo will come in to speak about the damaging image of China in Africa and its impact of Chinese investments in Africa. And the last speaker of today's webinar will be Mr. Bamba Ibrahim Khalil, who will be speaking on the issues of COVID-19 and mining investment in Guinea. So I would wish to invite now Professor Jing to take the floor and to lead us through. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone here. And some people I couldn't see your faces, but I know you are here, and I'm very glad to see you again this time, since we attend our team and I attend ACCA GA in Abidjan in November 2019. And today I'm going to talk about some very recent policies, Chinese policies regarding COVID-19, and I would like to share my screen and so you can see my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. So today I give you some background of the COVID-19, what COVID-19 caused a policy change regarding China's foreign investment and foreign trade, because it's very, the subject we discussed last year during the GA, and this is a very recent change. So start from the, okay. Everyone knows the outbreak of COVID-19 started from Wuhan, the epicenter in China in early January. And Wuhan, I spent 4 years in Wuhan to pursue my undergraduate studies, so I know that city very well. So I concerned from very beginning. And after the Chinese government took measures to lock down the city and the country take a very strong measure, and we saw the COVID-19 spread to the world. And so today I won't talk about the COVID-19 itself, but the implication on our subject, our work. And so I would start from the first, the policy that I mentioned this time. Chinese government, our state council announced a white paper regarding the COVID-19, how China combating the COVID-19. That is the highest policy and policy paper announced by the state council, our government, this state council in June 7th this year. And you see I list the 4 chapters of this policy paper. And the last one is regarding our work. I will start from the first 3. The first 3 chapters are all talking about how China were dealing with COVID-19 and how China successfully controlled the outbreak. And so you can read this policy paper and you get your own takeaway. And but I would like to say, yes, China as a country, as a government, has made a successful effort to control COVID-19 within China. And it's quite a successful story, but it's really hard for other countries, other nations, other governments to copy it, because that success rely on certain preconditions. And I summarize some preconditions. First is the government. This government who wants make such success must have absolute control of power over the society and the lower local government. And this is the Chinese government, central government could do, and it can mobilize economic and political resource and concentrate just on one matter, that's the COVID-19. And Chinese government locked down the city with 15 million people who are living in the city of Wuhan, and completely locked down, and for almost 80 days. And it's really hard for other the government countries to copy that model. And the second precondition is the citizens of this country we are willing to give up some certain freedom, individual freedom, and for the collective effort. And that is our Chinese society. Chinese traditionally our countries, our society is a connective society, and people are willing to sacrifice to certain degree, sacrifices personal freedom for the collective success, and that is a precondition. And third is China has quite a strong economy, and which can afford the central government to take such measures, strong measure. And China has a technology which allow the government to use this strong measure to control the society. And that will follow many questions like the surveillance on the personal rights and the personal data has connected for this strong measure. Anyway, what my points China indeed made a very successful effort to combat COVID-19 within China. It's hard for other nations to follow because those preconditions, now other countries have such conditions. But what I would emphasize is not about China, what the Chinese government has done within China, but is what the Chinese government policy regarding its Belt Road Initiative on the foreign aid and the foreign investment and foreign trade. So in the fourth chapter of this white paper on fighting COVID-19, China in Action, it is focused on China's foreign policy under the COVID-19 crisis. And the name of this chapter is Building Global Community of Health for All. And it's very good expressed, well expressed the intention, and the policy paper needs some very important points which Chinese government would like to advocate for. And the first is in international solidarity and cooperation. It is what we need. And you, in this expression, you also see the global community of future. And if you remember last year, we talked about some slogans around the Belt Road Initiative, and that is one of the slogans. And in Chinese, and if you know the China's politics, you may have heard about this slogan, the global community of the future or shared destiny of the human being. All those slogans. It's from the one Chinese expression, the 内命运共同体, which is a slogan for the Belt Road Initiative. And once you know that. And the second, in this policy paper, mentions the managed pandemics impact global economy through cooperation. So in all the points I list here is China still very value very much on the current international trade and investment order, and still advocate for all the nations to respect the WHO, WTO, the current multilateral trade system. And that is what China has been benefiting from since China opened up in late 1990s. And China is the biggest beneficiary of the current globalization. So China would like keep this current globalization, even though we have to adjust it to the new condition. And in this newspaper, the white paper also emphasize China will assisting weaker countries and regions, and China participated in the date service suspension initiative, the ACCA, and this is a good news in general. In theory, it's good news to African nations because African nations are considered weaker countries and region economically. And so that is what the Chinese government mentioning in this policy paper. China is willing to help on the weaker countries, but by what means? And China lists in this white paper, China lists two: this relief, and another is medical supplies and the personnel will send to the weaker countries. And that is it's also mentioned in this the new global order. We should consider the sustainable global goal. And so I won't go too deeper, but in short, China still take this global the current multilateral trade and investment order very seriously, and showed the intention to help weaker countries. So that is the very recent, the highest white paper issued by the China State Council. And followed by that, the white paper, China organized this online China-Africa Summit, and it was called Extraordinary China-Africa Summit on Solidarity Against COVID-19, which held by in online and hosted by Chinese government, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and he gave a keynote speech entitled "Defeating COVID-19 with Solidarity and the Cooperation." And in this speech, and he promised within the forum on the China-African cooperation framework, China will cancel the debt from the relevant African country in the form of government loans that due to mutual by the end of the 2020. And so what call your attention is that is for the certain African country, they will get this data relief, but what loans will get, what kind of loans and can be applied to this policy, this data relief? It's governmental loans. It's not business, commercial loans. It's only the governmental loan which between China and African nation can get this data relief. And it's only the time is from now to the end of 2020. So that is one message, important message. And another message is Xi Jinping expressed we encourage Chinese financial institute to respond on the DSSI, the Data Service Suspicion Initiative. And when Xi Jinping said we encourage, that it expressed very strong signal. And as a president, if he encouraged Chinese banks to give the debt relief to African country, it's a very strong message. But also a little bit doubt this word encourage, because the Chinese banks are owned by the government, and he didn't say we will ask or we will order the Chinese banks to give the loan relief to African countries. He said we encourage. So it still shows there are some hesitations, and there are some conditions will apply, but we have to see. And that is from the Xi Jinping, our president, Chinese president, and the strong message can be found in this keynote speech. And the third policy is it's also very recent. Following this extraordinary online summit between China and African nations, and China also hosts another video conference on the Belt and Road Initiative, and joined by 20 other countries, the ministers from other countries, the 3 of them are from Africa. And this conference, I think, reinforced what Chinese government expressed in the white paper. and reinforce what Xi Jinping's keynotes expressed. So basically, it's reinforce we need to connect with each other and build a healthy Silk Roads. That is a new expression. And China said the joint statement by 20 Ministers of Foreign Affairs expressed the vaccine should be used as a global public good, should not be a commercial commodity, should be the global good, should be free. I think that what implied from this statement should be a public good for all the people who need it. And also this conference also asked for a nation to strengthen the interconnection. So it's also reinforced the importance to build infrastructure project and to connect people, and welcome the effort to restore the cross-border personnel flow, because it's without the cross-border personnel flow, China's Belt Road Initiative won't be able to continue. So it's very important to open up and the borders, which are now Chinese, the capital China personnel flow to the Belt Road countries. That is what China would like to do, and call for other nations, other Belt Road country, the country who joined China's Belt Road Initiative to follow. And in this conference, the economy and the economic recovery is also the focus of the discussing. And you see that the 20 ministers agreed we need to support the current multilateral trade and system, which already mentioned in China's white paper, and it's also reinforced. We should pay attention to the economic, social, financial, and economic sustainability of the Belt Road Initiative. Nothing new here, but what the new is the debt relief initiative. So that is mentioned again from the first white paper in early June, and to next this video conference. The debt relief is one of the important points. And China's, we talk about the three important events regarding China's foreign policy, China's policy on the foreign trade and investment. And it shows China still want to continue the Belt Road Initiative and still value very much for the current trade and international trade and investment system. And internally, China has taken measures to stimulate our domestic economy. And you see this at least the policy priorities for this year after the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis of the COVID-19. This is a 6 stabilizations, 6 securities, and all of them are around economy. And China emphasized foreign trade and foreign investment as one of the 6 stabilizations, and to put its very high position of the foreign trade and foreign investment. And the Chinese government, for the first time in 30 years, didn't set up the GDP target for our domestic economy. That is very, very new, and that implied what the government won't pursue the GDP, the number. And some of you may remember in the past 20 or 30 years, China has very rapid development of the economy. And we, in certain years, we have the GDP grows by 10, by 12, by 11 percentage. That is very high. And this year, the GDP will drop to very low. And so it is smart choice for the government. Don't set up the GDP target because it won't look good. And it also indicates Chinese government would like take this as a crisis, as an opportunity to change, reform China's economy from the purely pursue the economic goal to a more sustainable development. So that is a good thing. We can take the advantage of, and we also need to pay attention to it, the China's internal economic priorities. And there are some minister level policies from China's the various government department regarding the international trade and investment. And Minister of the Commerce and China Development Bank announced it will give the supporting loans to the high quality Belt Road project, and which was announced in March. And the Minister of Commerce also issued notice to further reform and opening up and stabilizing investment in responding to COVID-19. And very recently, the Minister of Commerce of the and the back of the construction also signed MOU to stabilize the foreign trade and investment. So all those policies I list here to just show one point. The Chinese government take the international trade and international investment to a very important role, because it's one very important aspect of China's economy, and China's development rely on the international trade and investment. So that ensure China's Belt Road Initiative will be continuing and from the support of the Chinese central government. And what we could do, what we, the civil society organization, should be prepared. Many of us are in the very challenging time to adjust our work, and regarding our work on the Chinese investment in African continent, what can we do? And this is what I would like to suggest we do collectively. Is we need to demand our government. From my end, it's Chinese government, and your end, your country's government demanded the transparency of the debt relief process. And we, civil society organization, should participate in the process and to renegotiate the deal, the loans, and the governmental loans, commercial loans with Chinese banks, and the natural resource for the infrastructure deal, which very commonly used in Africa between China and the African nations. And we need to urge the government to renegotiate those deals if those deals are not fair to African nations, to African communities. And I would also suggest we would have to pay close attention to the individual the project you are working on. And we talk about the policy level, the national government level, what we can do, and for the project you are working on, and to pay attention to those Chinese companies to see if any there's COVID-19, their measures will affect the communities, and like the workers, if local worker can get the wage on time, and if they lay off the workers, and if those measures and the extra burden on the community and surrounding community, all those factors you have to pay attention, and then find a solution to deal with those individual projects. And that is what look at the policy from your national government, Chinese policy, as well as we have to pay close attention to those projects where monitoring we have been working on, we have been monitoring, and that is what we can do from the bottom up. So that is what I will talk. I talked, and I'm waiting. I'm looking forward to further discussing later during this webinar.
Thank you, Professor. There is really been an opening stage for critical discussion going forward and questions. Picking up some of the issues that pop up from your presentation, exactly the issues of partnership and interconnection, the issues of transparency, the issues of involvement of different people, different stakeholders. I think they've been very instrumental, particularly looking into the initiative the government of China is putting in place. But what's also, you triggered some of the issues that will, I think, coming up on questions, or I mean, also how can Africa can take all these other things in an accountable manner. So maybe without further ado, I'll now wish to invite, but I also encourage our participants to use the chat room to bring in issues of discussions, but also we are also on live stream on Facebook, and this webinar is also recorded. So now Dr. Sean, please welcome. And I might also wish to remind our panelists if we may be within the time frame of 10 minutes, so that we can also have further interactive sections with our participants. And to our participant, please kindly mute your mic so we can have one good conversation. And yes, welcome, Dr. Sean.
Okay, thank you. So I guess Benjamin was going to put my my PowerPoint online to share it on the screen. I just want to apologize to Umo. I know Umo was supposed to go second, but I guess I'm going to go second instead. So apologies to my good friend Umo. It's been now more than a year that Jingjing and I went to Abidjan to speak to the ACCA General Assembly about China, and I am really grateful to be here and to see some familiar names and faces. I just finished a research project on the social impact of the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway, and I was supposed to go to Kenya to do field work and interview people for that, but unfortunately I couldn't. Anyway, I hope at some point that we can all meet soon, and I'm very grateful to ACCA for having this, this webinar. So I wanted to talk about mutual aid and workers in China during COVID-19 and the implications for Chinese investment in Asia and Africa. And I think Jingjing gave a really nice summary of the high-level policies. So I want to kind of just look now at the issue of workers, and maybe we can go to the next slide. So this is, I know that I'm in the US right now, and right now in the US, everybody is talking about Black Lives Matter, and that's certainly very important. But I also want to call attention to workers' lives as well. This is a picture of a construction worker in Wuhan who is so tired that I guess he's standing up to sleep, and he was involved in building one of the hospitals in Wuhan to isolate the COVID-19 patients. So I wanted to talk about workers' lives because it's a very important issue at this point in our history. Workers and inequality, especially during this pandemic and after. I think the pandemic, and I'm speaking not just about China, I'm speaking about around the world. The pandemic is, I think, a game-changing moment for workers and inequality in our world, because it is accelerating the rate at which inequality is taking place. We can see this very clearly in the way that companies are using the pandemic to downsize, to lay off workers, to reduce their wages, but not necessarily reduce the wages of senior management, who feel that they are essential. And I think China, where the pandemic began, is just one example of this. So we know that the unemployment rate has gone up in China. We don't know the figures that I have been able to get are it's now at 6%, but the official figure for unemployment among workers, younger workers from age 16 to 24, is more than twice as high. It's at 13.8%. We also know that China will be having 8 million college graduates who will be having a difficult time finding decent employment this year. And according to a new survey, 1 in 3 white-collar workers in China have been laid off since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, the majority of white-collar workers have experienced pay cuts, salary cancellations, or delays in payments. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, I'm sorry. Can we move to the next slide? I was just talking about workers and inequality. So, yeah, so here, just talking about workers on the front lines. I mean, workers on the front line are, of course, essential to containing COVID, but they're also very vulnerable. And I just want to recognize them. The majority of medical workers, by the way, in China, I also want to recognize women workers, but the majority of medical workers in China are women. So in the province of Hubei alone, in Hubei, that's where Wuhan is, that's where the coronavirus first broke out. In Hubei province, there was an estimated 100,000 women who were working as frontline medical staff. Thousands of these medical staff in China were infected because they did not have adequate personal protective equipment. We call this PPE. And also because they were working under very high stress and for very long hours. Some of these people, such as Dr. Li Wenliang, he was a doctor in Wuhan, he was trying to warn people about the virus back in December. And he was told by the local police to stop spreading rumors. And then he later died in February after he contracted the virus. There are also thousands of construction workers in the city of Wuhan. And these construction workers, thousands of them came together to work in 2 shifts around the clock to construct a hospital just for the COVID patients. And they did this in 10 days. So the picture I have in this PowerPoint is of Dr. Li Wenliang when he's after he's contracted the virus. He took a picture of himself. Maybe we can move to the next slide. And so I would like to talk here about what workers are doing to defend themselves. And first of all, I said here that workers have no unions to defend them. And they've largely had to rely on themselves. And this is an unusual characteristic of China, because China only has one union. It's called the All China Federation of Trade Unions. But it's a government, created union. It is under the party state, and it often, instead of defending workers or representing workers, it often stands with the government and also with companies. So in this case, under COVID, the ACFTU has not been doing much to really support workers. So workers have really had to rely on themselves. I mean, so in the case of these construction workers that were building these hospitals, some of them had to ask for back pay because they were not being paid in time. Medical staff, we have cases of medical staff who are also asking for payment of government subsidies that they were owed. And then we also have cases of taxi drivers. So thousands of taxi drivers in China, many of them were struggling financially, were protesting to demand reductions in their taxi rental fees. So that's the picture here that you see in this, that's the picture you see here in this PowerPoint, are taxi drivers holding up banners calling for reductions in their fees. It's hard, I will say that, tell you that in China, it's very difficult to get pictures of protests because it's, these pictures are often deleted from social media. So this is, I think, one of the few pictures that I could find. Now we can go to the next slide, please. In addition to workers defending themselves, civil society has provided also assistance for workers as well in the form of mutual aid groups. And here I will say that civil society groups, and in particular labor groups in China, have been under tremendous pressure over the last few years because the current Chinese government has cracked down on many of these labor groups, and a number of them have been detained and arrested or driven underground. So that has made it much more difficult for civil society to provide assistance to workers, but some have found ways to help. And they found ways to help by providing personal protective equipment like masks and gloves to sanitation workers. So sanitation workers play an important role in public health, and many people don't understand that. So some of these civil society groups have been trying to call attention to the role that sanitation workers play, that they are working without adequate personal protective equipment, and trying to get some of these masks and gloves to sanitation workers. Other civil society groups have opened hotlines for workers to educate them about how to prevent the spread of the coronavirus, and also providing legal advice about their labor and employment rights. Other groups have been helping workers by calling on landlords to reduce the rents for workers from rural areas, what we call rural migrant workers. In China, there are something over like 200 million rural migrant workers. They have migrated from the countryside to the cities to work there. Other groups have also been providing electronic devices to children of rural migrant workers. As you know, many of you know, many schools now are doing classes online. But of course, to be able to do classes online, you have to have the right kind of computer, you need to have some kind of internet access, and children in cities have much better access to those than children who live in the countryside. So this is an issue that also has been raised as well. Also, civil society and labor groups have been helping workers who were told to go back to work too early before the government raised the lockdown, or they've gone back to work without adequate protection. And civil society groups have helped workers to file complaints to local authorities about this. And in some cases, it's had some effect because the local authorities have then issued penalties for those companies that told their workers to go back to work too early. Let's go to the next slide, where I want to talk about the implications for workers in Chinese invested workplaces in Asia and Africa. And so this is a picture of Sihanoukville in Cambodia. Some people call this a Chinatown because it was taken over by the Chinese. So Chinese investment in infrastructure has been quite substantial in Cambodia. But as a result of this investment in infrastructure, there's also been about billions of dollars that have poured into places like Sihanoukville to invest in the building of casinos and online gambling establishments. And this has brought in many Chinese immigrants into that city, and it has pushed up the rents and living costs, and it has also brought in illegal gambling and human trafficking. So there's a lot of negative side effects that accompanied this investment in casinos and gambling. And last year, the Prime Minister of Cambodia ordered a ban on all online gambling activities. So as a result of that ban, the casinos had to start laying off their staff, and all the construction work stopped. And construction workers were not paid as a result. And in this, at this time, someone did an interesting survey of both Chinese and Cambodian workers working in this in Sihanoukville. And I just want to give you a few facts about what was found in the survey, because it tells you something about how vulnerable these workers are, both Chinese and Cambodian. So the survey showed that 97% of Cambodian workers and 75% of Chinese workers were casual workers. They did not have a contract. Many of these workers were owed wages. There was a difference in the payment of Cambodian workers and Chinese workers, and I'll tell you why that's important later. But Cambodian workers were paid between 8 to 20 US dollars a day. The women workers were only paid between 8 to 10 US dollars a day. The Chinese workers were paid much more. The Chinese workers were paid US $50 to $72 a day. So they were paid almost more than 3 or 4 times the amount that Cambodian workers were paid. Among these workers, bonuses were rare, and only 14% of Chinese workers and no Cambodian workers had any insurance or social security. When asked whether local labor laws in Cambodia could offer protection, 98% of Chinese workers said no, and 54% of Cambodians said no. Interestingly, even though there are a number of independent Cambodian unions, the unions were not present in Sihanoukville to help these workers. And finally, and this goes back to the difference in pay between Chinese and Cambodian workers, solidarity between Chinese and Cambodian workers is very weak due to the unequal pay structure.
Cambodia n'était pas tellement bien clair.
Chinese workers said their higher pay was justified. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. Please.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway, only 36% of Cambodian workers said that the higher pay for Chinese workers was justified. So we can see a number of problems that come out from this one case study in Sihanoukville that I think is also very typical of workplaces, not just in Cambodia, but in other countries. So let me just go to the final slide. And this is a picture of a sanitation worker strike in Guangzhou, which is the city where I lived before I had to come to the US because of the COVID-19. But this was a very successful strike among Chinese workers, where sanitation workers were able to have their jobs given back to them. They had lost their jobs because of a change in company, and then they organized and were able to negotiate their jobs back. But I just want to say that, again, remind people that workers' lives do matter, that companies during and after the pandemic will be looking to cut costs, and workers around the world, in Asia, in Africa, will be among the most vulnerable. I think we have seen that governments have played an important role in strengthening public health. But I think we also need to see strong support from governments for workers and for civil society, that will be critical. And in addition, civil society itself, unions, mutual aid groups, other civil society groups such as ACCA, you play a critical role to ensure that workers have decent wages and working conditions by providing assistance to these workers, by strengthening transparency. We need to understand what's the impact on workers, by creating grievance and dispute resolution mechanisms for workers, and by advocating for government to better enforce labor laws. If we don't do this, then we know for sure that inequality in this world will continue to grow. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Sean. Well, you have touched on the issues that I think they'll be very pertinent coming to the African context and the Chinese investment, and also looking into the first presentation by Dr. Jing. So thank you for putting those insights and alluding and sort of reminding workers' lives matters, but also how civil society and the government should be in the foreplay to ensure that COVID-19 does not bring about inequalities, and how that can really be discussed or enhanced in the policies that we have seen, but also in the interconnection that what the Chinese government is trying or have been put in place in this COVID-19, and as we are looking forward into the new normal. So I would wish now, I also wish to apologize and thank you for bringing in that apology to Mr. Umo. And now, Mr. Umo, the floor is yours. And on the topic of the damaging image of China in Africa and its impact on Chinese investment in Africa. And I think it will really build on what the two panelists have already shared with us from their initial presentations. Welcome, Mr. Umo. Umo?
Please, can you unmute Umo?
Umo, please unmute your mic. Translators, if you may help us also to translate. Sound you? Hello, Umo. Kindly unmute your mic.
Am I communicating now?
Yes, thank you very much.
Am I communicating? Yeah? I've done so.
Yes, yes, we can hear you now. Thank you. Kindly proceed.
I'm communicating. Okay, I want to thank everybody present and ACCA for the opportunity given to me. My presentation is on damaging image of China in Africa, its impact on Chinese investment in Africa. It is understanding fact that Africa is the playing host to over 15% of global natural resources around the globe. With these developments, there is a high influx of Chinese into Africa in order to gain more access to these natural resources. About 10,000 Chinese-owned firms set to operate in Africa. That was as at 2017, which the statistics has grown up. Chinese investment in Africa. In 2015, $100 million was said to be injected into Africa through EU. Same year, 60 billion was also sent to Africa for development projects cut across for 3 years. Also, China also support Africa in the area of capacity buildings, in the area of defense, counter-terrorism. Other investment areas also include transfer of technology, road constructions, mining, manufacturing, of recent, gas and oil, especially in a country like Nigeria, Uganda, Mozambique, and Algeria. China investment in Africa continent, we cannot overemphasize on that, but usually it comes with high critical sectors. And this is always tied to nations' critical area, and it comes with, their loans is tied to a very tight collaterals, which is if you fail to pay, they are at risk of losing all those things to China. And these things are always not negotiable with the citizens. So where our most concern is in the area of relationship between African countries, China, and the relationship with the masses, common man, who are always at the receiving ends of all these impacts. We look at the relationship between Africa and China, and we want to ask a very critical question. Has relationship between the two countries or continents so far been beneficial to Africans the way it is to China? This is a moral question that needs to be answered critically. To Africans, especially our leaders, it is all about economic development, while the poor masses, who are always at the receiving end, see it as a new colonial and exploitative in nature. If we look at what Michael Sata, that was when he was campaigning, not when he was a president. As at that time, he was speaking the language of the masses. He said, European colonial exploitation in comparison to China exploitation appears bigger, because when though the commercial exploitation was just as bad, but the colonial agents also invested in social, economic, infrastructure services. Chinese investment, on the other hand, is focused on making out of Africa as much as can be taken out without any regard to the welfare of the local people. He went further to say, we want the Chinese to leave the old colonial rulers to return. According to him, they exploited our natural resources too, but at least they took good care of us. They built schools. Yes, I'm a living witness to this. If not those schools that were built by colonial masters, I may have been in jungle by now, struggling with our animals. But now have been trained to even speak before you. But can the Chinese tell us what they have done to build in terms of even talking about corporate social responsibilities? How many, for my 15 years in development services, I think I cannot count those corporate social responsibilities stem from China in our rural communities. This is the same case in all African region, and we need this. They need to amplify this more. accusation of China in Africa, a Marxist viewpoint. Illegal mining in Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, Tanzania, South Africa, especially Northern Cape and Limpopo province, Mozambique, etc. Corruption in Angola, Guinea, other African countries. Environmental degradation. When we talk of the environmental degradation, we are looking at loss of biodiversities, which has almost gone in African countries. We look at erosion controls, erosions that they have created in the northern part of Nigeria and other regions. They are embarking on this illegal gold mining. We are looking at ground and surface water pollution. It's, if you can count the animals, we also look at poor working conditions for Africans working in their corporations. Yes, there are a lot of discriminations. While these Chinese are living in a very comfortable wages, what about those who are from our continent? They are giving them a peanut that cannot even take them home. They are milking them like they are another form of slavery in their own soil. What about influx of substandard goods in African markets? Chinese are sending down substandard goods to Africans, where they are easily having a ready-made market to market all their substandard goods, while in Europe, the standard is there. So how do they regard us? What are the implications in African development? Quelling of armed bandits. In the northern part of Nigeria, where I come from, there are a lot of issues of insecurity regarding in all the mining sites. So I think this is similar to every other country in Africa where mining is coming from. Then illegal mining and COVID-19. Yeah, it will be recalled that in Nigerian government, in May or April, when the pandemic was so high, they told us that, and by this time, they have banned all forms of international travels. But the government of Nigeria said they want to bring in medical experts from China, even though at that time, our medical doctors were performing credibly well in the fight against this pandemic, COVID-19. But the Nigerian government said they want to bring Chinese to come and do this. But when they came, the numbers, when they came, the first thing, they said they want to quarantine them for 14 days. And they said they have quarantine. Before that 14 days, the game changes. They said, some said the government could not trace where they were. After then, all what the masses, including the legislative angle of the apex of the government, kick against for their coming, but they still impose this on the masses. When they came, till today, we cannot count what their success is. What the Nigerian government went further to inform the masses was that, oh, some of them were not medical experts, some were skilled workers currently working in a Chinese company, CCE. What type of tricks are we in Africa? Can't for once our African leaders tell us the truth and also be specific in their language? In April 2019, all forms of illegal mining activities was banned in Zamfara State in Nigeria, northern part of Nigeria. This was linked to alleged banditry killings in that axis. But despite all this, on April 25th, 2 Chinese, as was seen there, were arrested in Kwali villages in Zamfara State for illegal gold mining. Also, in Osun State, 19 Chinese nationals were there, and 9 Nigerians were also arrested with the combination task force, with the effort of joint task force for illegal mining, they were able to arrest these people, hand it over to Nigerian government. Oh, the Minister of Mines and Steel Development. I'm talking of Adegbeti, who is the current minister. He was telling the masses of how influential politicians in Nigeria are mounting pressure on them for the release of these people. Why? Because they are working in collaboration with them, and also the law enforcement agents who are supposed to protect the interests and well-being of the masses. But now the reverse is the case. So as at now, that case, as we are told, is in the courts. But I'm not so much excited with this. Why? Because in 2018, 16 Chinese and 9 other Nigerians, including a former governorship aspirant, a platform of the Front Congress for Progressive Change. I'm talking of Alhaji Abdullahi, otherwise known as Dan China. They were arrested and prosecuted in Jos Plateau State. After they were prosecuted, in fact, I think it wasn't too long, they said all of them were set free. So why are we deceiving ourselves when the masses cannot be tell the truth in connection with what is going on in Nigeria, on Africa as a whole? Also, we are talking about way forward. We said no country can survive on its own without beneficial interactions and mutual cooperations. Thus, China needs to rethink its image in African continents. They need to be more proactive in dealings to protect its trade and economic interests. It's time for African leaders to view development in Africa as a continent against a bigger umbrella than politics. Yes, I drew example of Michael Sata. He was so much fighting for against these new colonial forces coming into the country or the nation. But as soon as he was elected as a president in the year 2011, his language and everything changes. He was now dining and whining with the Chinese at the expense of the poor masses. We also look at visibility of corporate social responsibility in areas of operations, which I have said already, I have not seen much in the axis of Chinese in Africa. Engagement with public, including support, stroke partnership with relevant CSOs against using government connection, coverage from uniformed men to embark on illegal operations. Yes, the umbrella, the coverage of uniformed men to protect and mastermind this illegal mining from miners from China is very much noticed. So there's need for us to say no. Yes, special courts needs to be set for speedy trial of foreigners engaged in illegal mining activities across African countries with appropriate sanction when convicted. This should also be applicable not only to Chinese, but other continents that are coming to Africa to exploit us the more. It is time for the civil society group to join hands together and say no. Yes, the civil society group has not done much. Yes, even ACCA, I think it is a wake-up call for ACCA to start coordinating its members, to start functioning, to monitor the activities of China's and other multinationals in African continents, and in order to reposition the nation for the task ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Umo. I was struggling with the technology a little. Thank you. I think you alluded really touching issues, and this is building in the conversation we had in last year in Ivory Coast during ACCA General Assembly. The same questions were also posed to ACCA members. Who should be responsible? How are we putting our leaders accountable? But also, how do masses and civil society engage in all these accountability processes? Giving an example is just going through the timeline on your presentation, starting from 25th, if I record correctly, in April to 18 May, within COVID-19 pandemic period, so much has happened in just one country within the African continent. We do not know the stories probably of other countries, but how do we ourselves accountable and follow up on these issues? How is there transparency? Is there a transparency mechanism that everyone can be able to know what is on the ground? And these are exactly issues which Professor Jingjing alluded in her presentation on this interconnection of partnership. So I think going forward, we'll have more conversations, but let's now see how we'll go forward with this webinar. I also wish to remind our participants to use the chat room to bring the discussions, any insightful issues that you pick up from the presentations. We will have an interactive section, but also we need to be mindful of our time. We started a bit late, so we don't know how long we can go beyond the already scheduled time. And at the same time, we have interpretation sections. So for those who are using English and French, kindly watch through your monitor in your laptop or computers. There is a segment where it shows interpretation. And the last one is our presenter, panelist, Mr. Bamba Ibrahim Karil. I am informed he will be presenting in French, so kindly also, I'm gently reminding you to switch your translation mode, just in case you will not be able to follow in French. But also, I'll wish to remind Mr. Bamba if we can also be candid enough to be within 10 to 15 minutes, so at least we can have some time for reaction from former panelists and also from our participants in the webinar. And we are live streaming, so kindly follow up this and share with other members of ACCA in your network. Welcome, Mr. Bamba.
Oh, merci Maria. Je salue tous ceux qui ont débattu, ont présenté avant moi.
Thank you, Maria, and I'd like to appreciate the presenters who presented before me, and I'm very pleased to add my contribution to the topic discussed here, which is Chinese investments. My presentation will be on the impact of COVID-19 as well as Chinese investment, the impact of Chinese investment in the mining sector in Guinea.
Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran?
Can you see my screen? I've just shared my screen.
Yes.
D'accord. Donc, rapidement,
Well, quickly, let me give you the outline of my presentation. It is based on 4 main key points. I'm going to go quickly. Primarily, I will give you a few key indicators on the Guinean economy, as well as the role of China in investments, in mining investments in Guinea, as well as and after that, I will attempt to give you a bit of a background of the mining sector in Guinea before the COVID-19 pandemic. And that would be followed by the current context. And I would also like to touch on the impacts of COVID-19 on the mining sector, as well as end with Chinese investments. Of course, on that specific point, I would like to look at the way forward uh, with regards to Chinese investments. So, as an introduction, I would like to remind that Guinea was the first country to establish bilateral relations with China. That was in 1959 for the sub-Saharan African region. In 2003, China became the main trading partner of Guinea after France. And since 2010, we have seen an acceleration of and an increase of Chinese investments in Guinea in infrastructure, in sectors such as mining, infrastructure, and trade. And in 2016, China became the main partner of exports from Guinea, especially bauxite, and the first supplier of products imported from Guinea. You can see there the context as I have just established it. Let's look at a number of key figures here. We have figures from 2017. Mining represents 20% of Guinea's GDP and contributes to the tune of 32% of state revenue, and that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the mining sector in our economy. And there are a number of Chinese businesses operating in the mining sector, and they are mainly focused on the exploitation of bauxite, and all these Chinese companies mentioned here are primarily active in that specific mining sector. We have SMB Mining Winning, which is the company that contributed to propulsing to making Guinea the second biggest exporter of bauxite around the world, and other Chinese enterprises. We can see here the portion of Chinese investments in the mining sector in Guinea. Uh, I'm showing here the share of Guinean enterprises with Chinese investments in Guinea. When you aggregate all these figures, you can see that the Chinese companies produce 54% of total bauxite production in Guinea, and these same enterprises are active in the exports to the tune of 51% of Chinese companies. That provides you with an idea of the role that Chinese companies play in export in Guinea. Of course, that raises a number of issues regarding transparency, etc., that I will dwell on a bit later. Here I am showing a number of trends pre-COVID-19 in the mining sector in Guinea. It was a very dynamic sector before COVID-19. Bauxite was doing quite well. So overall, the mining sector was quite healthy pre-COVID-19. And here we have a comparative table of production and exports of bauxite. Let's not dwell too much on the figures. What I would like to bring to the fore here is that when we look at the sums we can clearly observe that over the past 3 years, production and exports have been relatively at the same level despite the pandemic. In the first quarter, we can see that the mining sector, for the time being or in the short term, is doing quite well, is taking the impact quite well. However, this situation may just be temporary. And why do I say that? Simply because when we look at data published in China for May, shows a slowdown of the economy, which does not lend to much optimism. And of course, the economy of Guinea has also seen some slowdown in April, -9%, and iron, that's for aluminium, and iron -4.7%. That is a result of the drop in the demand from China. If you consider that Indonesia, after 18 months, resumed the production of bauxite, Guinea has all the reasons in the world to ask itself questions in terms of its partnership with China, because when you look at the situation comparatively, our bauxite comes from very far away compared to Indonesia. So we have reasons to ask ourselves a number of questions. So despite the pandemic, we have a paradoxical situation. Business, of course, with our Chinese partners continues. But in the meantime, we can see a slowdown of investments globally, and the report from the United Nations Conference on Investments has given us a clear reminder of that. When you look at the mining sector, thanks to Chinese investments, we can see quite a few changes in that sector. Guinea signed a contract of $20 billion for the construction of infrastructure. This is over a 20-year period. And this agreement was signed in great opacity, and there is absolutely no transparency surrounding this agreement. We have no idea what the terms are and what impact that may have on future generations. And there are many Chinese corporations that benefited from that. China Co, China Henan International Corporation Group, etc. And in February 2020, the pandemic was already prevailing in China, and there was an initiative that was launched by the two governments. And in May, with despite all restrictions, Guinea managed to organize a charter flight for 200 Chinese mine workers. So you can see the preferential treatment that the Guinean government gives to China. And on June 26, recently, a few days ago, our National Assembly voted a new convention granting exploitation blocks for iron to two international companies. This concession was worth $15 billion. And of course, China has a long-term vision. And of course, despite the pandemic, business continues. Now let's look at the concrete impacts of COVID-19 on the mining sector. We have seen losses, job losses, and of course for the economy, the budget deficit has also increased because a number of expenditure which were initially targeted in for certain towards certain sector have had to be redirected towards the COVID-19. And of course, in terms of the mobility of the workforce, that does not apply to Chinese workers. They have preferential treatment, as I mentioned earlier. Of course, growth will drop from 5 to 6% to about 2% plus. Of course, tax revenue will also be impacted. And of course, lockdown and the restrictions of international personnel. Besides that, there is the risk of over-indebtment and indebtedness of the Guinean government. So, yeah, those are some of the issues. Now, I would like to now end my presentation with the way forward. You know, for me, that is these are more questions. We have questions backed, contracts backed by mining resources, which expose Guinea very much in terms of the diversification of the economy. There are also secret agreements that do not contribute, that are not transparent, because we have no idea what the terms of these agreements are. We have the example of Sri Lanka. There are also a number of challenges regarding the respect of local content. China imports its workforce into the country. As I mentioned in May, 200 Chinese workers were brought into Guinea. When you ask populations affected by the importation of Chinese workforce, they have no idea who to talk to. These companies hide behind the state or the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Mining, because they are presented as the guarantors of their presence on the territory. There's also the issue of access, lack of access to data on Chinese investments in Guinea. These are some of the issues that should raise concerns, especially for us as members of ACCA. We have also the acceleration and intensification of impacts with all infrastructure projects. There has been a sort of promotion of Chinese business, and of course that has an impact on rural areas. That was essentially what I had prepared for my presentation today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bamba. Well, all our panelists, I think, have really gone very deep in their presentations, and I don't not really have much to add from this wise and length of information that we have received from our four panelists. And now I would wish to open the interactive section for questions, for any clarification, any contribution, and you may either raise your hand by reacting, or you can unmute your mic to speak. Maybe I'll start while we are waiting for our good friends within the platform to come in. And maybe mine will be, how do we relate the current Chinese policies and has been happening, or what is happening in Africa? And I look into the presentation of Nigeria, for instance, those doctors, presumably, and then they disappeared in the midst of nowhere. And what we just heard from Guinea, the experience in between COVID-19, there have been 2 contracts which have been signed. There is still lack of transparency. So given your experiences, Professor Jingjing and Dr. Sean, how do you think the current policies can really try to unveil this, I would say, sentiment from African civil society and human rights activists?
Yeah, let me start. I think it's our goal for this webinar. And we are, from the beginning, we discussed with ACCA, me and the ACCA the secretary team, we discussed. I think it's a good opportunity right now to think about how we can change this crisis to an opportunity and for our work. And I list all the recent policies regarding China's foreign investment, foreign trade, and other speakers mentioned the damaging image of China in Africa. I think it's an opportunity for us to start to think about how we can start from the demanding transparency from our government, our governments, from my end is Chinese government, and your end, your own national government and local government. First step is let's request the current deal with China. Current the agreement like Bamba said the Guinea China and the non-cooperation framework that is not public available, and we tried from both sides, from China and from Guinea, we have tried to request our government to release it. We still haven't got it. For some country, the civil society organization have got. So I would suggest that is the first stage, and to use this crisis as opportunity, ask our national government to release the agreement with China. The known agreement, the natural resource for infrastructure deal, those relevant agreements, and we can start from that. That is to provide our basic foundation for our next stage of work, that is renegotiation with those unfair deals. So that is what I have been thinking. I think it's practical and we can do. Sean, do you have other suggestions?
Yeah, thank you, Jing. And thank you for the question. I mean, yeah, that's a really important question. I think on the Chinese side, the review of Chinese policies for the overseas investment, if you look at those policies, they speak in quite general terms about social responsibility and environmental protection, but there's really very few, there's not any concrete mechanisms or punishments for companies that engage in kind of behavior that is socially or environmentally damaging. And we know that some industry associations in China have tried to provide guidelines for companies. And I think, Chinese companies are interested in knowing what they can do. But I think at this point, given that we have this kind of policy on the Chinese side, there is this kind of a policy gap. I think that the other side, of course, is the African, the host government side. They, of course, to strengthen the development of policies that are more socially favorable, to strengthen enforcement of policies, to strengthen regulation in African countries is critical. And on these sort of development agreements for different projects, I was thinking, you know, it's really critical that civil society has a voice early on in the process, because too often, as some of our presenters, you know, showed, what happens is that you wait until the the Chinese company comes in, they make the investment, and then we understand what the social environmental impacts are afterwards, and then we're left, and then these countries, you're left to clean up the mess. We need to start early in the process. So I don't know if it's possible to have some kind of a multi-stakeholder participation in these kinds of, in discussing these development agreements, in discussing investments for, the development agreements for specific projects, to have unions and to have civil society as well as companies and industry associations sit at the same table to shape these kinds of agreements, and to have input on this early on in the process. So that's just one idea.
Thank you so much, Professor Jingjing and Dr. Sean. But maybe also adding to that, I also see the threat of shrinking civil civic space, both not just in Africa, but also in China. Looking into the presentation Sean I've shared with us, I would imagine the same opportunities and the kind of strategies could be what is used even in African Chinese investments. And if that is not coming out really vividly and speaking about them firmly, the threat of workers' rights, and here I will really want to focus on women, might just be diluted somewhere. So the voices of civil society, as much as now we know their policies, we need to streamline how we bring out these issues without fear and doubt, of course, but having strategic engagements. I remember in a GA, we mentioned something like open door policies with Chinese embassies. And the most, what we heard from the ACCA members was it's not easy to get access, even to share what is on the ground. And now it's more harder if there is no transparency in these agreements. And now it's even more conflicting if all those contracts, we are not certain if it's within bilateral governments, if it's between businesses, if it's between individuals, if it's between Chinese who are already citizens in these particular countries. So I think that wave really need to be unveiled and coming out progressively, and having civil society having a best and better understanding, given now this COVID-19 sort of bringing out a lot of open eye to a lot of not just civil society, but even regular employers and workers within these Chinese companies and within the bilateral contracts or any other contracts and investments that are happening, not just in Africa, but also in other countries where they have been investing. I see there's a question, but it's in French. Maybe if I may invite Yida to ask the question direct. Or if we may get a translation.
Are there a number of agreements on the continent or at sub-regional level likely to become a model for regulation of Chinese investments in Africa? Well, are there a number of agreements that could be an inspiration in terms of a model for the regulation of Chinese investment in Africa? The second part of the question, of course, in these bilateral agreement with China and African states, okay, so the fact that these agreements are bilateral, is that not a strategy used to weaken the capacity of African states to guarantee the taking into consideration of social and environmental issues related to these investments? That is the question that was asked in French. It's pretty much the same question that was sent twice. Yeah, that's the question. I mean, those are the questions.
I can answer the first question. To my knowledge, there is no multilateral agreement between China and the African nations regarding the investment. So this is all individual countries signed either the bilateral investment agreement treaty with China, or the signed agreement to join China's Belt Road Initiative, or some African nations national government signed agreement with individual Chinese company. So there are all sorts of type of agreements. I think next webinar, I would like to give a list of those agreement or deal. Then we can use that as a clue to seek the transparency, and we can request, I mean, the group here, ACCA members can ask your government to release those deals. And for example, I want to say is Guinea. We all know there is a framework agreement between called the non-framework agreement between Guinea and China, but we haven't seen it. And there's a memo for Guinea to join China's Belt Road Initiative. We didn't see that document either. So that is my answer to this question. There's no treaty between China and the African Union, but it's a good idea. I think it's good we can work on it. We can urge African Union, if we have a capacity to work on the African Union platform, to urge to sign this treaty between China and the African Union regarding investment.
Thank you, Prof. I also see we are running out of time. So maybe now I'll invite our panelists maybe to 1 minute or 2 minutes each just to speak about the topic of today, and also to, if there's anything, but also to our participants, there's a second poll. Kindly would also be grateful for you to come in and see it on your screen. Yes, it's both in French and English. Kindly, if you may also fill in those polls. And after the 2 minutes from our panelists, I'll invite Benjamin from the Secretariat, and then I'll just say a few words to close. Welcome with no any order. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Bamba. Mr. Bamba, 2 minutes. Okay, I see.
Merci beaucoup, Maria. Moi, je dirais juste, je conclurai sur 3 points.
I will be responding on 3 items. What are the challenges that we are facing as civil organizations in general? First of all, there is a kind of awareness concerning the matter that we need to mobilize and to make sure that transparency might be quite clear when we come to Chinese investment. There is civil society organization that has been established to make sure how to monitor the way natural resources are managed. However, what is quite not understandable that most of the stakeholders interested in the matter, they don't have enough information concerning those agreements with China. Those agreements are not advertised, are not known from the public. Why not to make sure to have some meetings to know what is happening, what about those agreements with Chinese? However, most of those stakeholders don't have enough capacities or not enough um, uh, capacities how to account those Chinese companies. Dr. Sham and others, Chamji, how to do that kind of monitoring. Also, that other paradox that are there, those communities, for them to understand all the stakes. There's a study that was 83 of people in no 61% then of Africans think that Chinese investments are having positive side when we come to investments. So 83% they think Chinese are helping Africa, but it's our duty to make sure that we have to speak. We have to explain to the communities, to the masses, to know what is happening and what is Chinese are doing, and to find solutions to correct that kind of situations.
Thank you, Mr. Bamba.
Merci, merci, Monsieur Bomba.
If I may now welcome Mr. Umo, 2 minutes, please. Your contribution, suggestions, and way forward.
I want to appreciate everyone that has been here with us. I want to employ my co-panelists to put more pressure in their home governments to see Africans as part of human beings. What they expect from Africa should be exact thing they expect from themselves. So I believe in the session, biblical session, that do unto others what you want others to do unto you. So that is my final word. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Umo. Dr. Sean, please, 1 minute, 2 minutes. And also, I think the poll was up, but now it has gone. I hope we've been able to react on the poll as our IT team put it up. Kindly welcome, Dr. Sean.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Yes, so again, I want to thank ACCA for having me on this webinar. It's been very educational. I do want to say, I agree with what Bamba said, and you know, in terms of, I think, and what also Maria said about the important role that African civil society is playing. I think that from the Chinese side, I think it's very difficult for Chinese civil society to play that kind of accountability and monitoring role, because as Maria said, civic space in China has become quite restricted, and it's very difficult for civil society in China to play that role. And I think, you know, in terms of just one example of the role that civil society, African civil society, can play, it's to demand, as you know, Bamba said, more data about the impacts of investment on different groups, on especially marginalized groups. And I found this out when I was doing the research on the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway. It was very difficult to find any data about the impacts on women. How useful is the railway to women? What impacts has it had on employment, on livelihoods for women? And that's because no data is kept on this information, on that. I think we had asked the National Gender Commission of this question, and they said they were looking into it and trying to find ways to, you know, to record data about this. But, you know, just that simple fact, the simple act of just being able to get data on this is the first step. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sean. Kindly, Professor Jingjing, your final word contribution. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Maria, for the moderating the webinar. And there's some final points, and first, in the foreseeable future, you will still see the capital flow from China to Africa. So you will still see many Chinese companies and Chinese individuals, businessmen in your country. And so yeah, it's our long-term work, and there is no formula can solve all the problem. It needs our efforts from civil society, from the academic, and from the government, all the stakeholders to work together. And secondly, for my role and Sean and me, and we want to bridge African civil society organization with your counterpart in China, even though the space, we know civic space is shrinking in China, in your country too, but we try to push the envelope and build the bridge, and we would like to build the stronger connection and provide capacity, the training project to African civil society organization to better understand China's policies, Chinese laws, and we are here to participate with you. And the third is, I think ACCA is a unique organization platform, and it has so many members from all over Africa, and it can play a crucial role to call for collective and collective action together. I think it's very important we build the pressure not only from one project, one country, and from all Africa. And ACCA can do it, and because the membership organization, and we would like to. My team would like to help participants. So that is my final points, and thank you for ACCA for organizing this webinar. I'm looking forward to all the question and reaction, and I hope we will have a second webinar to discuss it further.
Thank you so much, Professor. We do appreciate. I right now wish to welcome Benjamin from the Secretariat. Benjamin, you disappeared.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you. I would like just to thank everyone. First, Maria, thank you very much for your moderation. And I would also like to thank all the panelists for the very insightful discussions we have today. And I think this is a first step, and yeah, we are going forward. We will be discussing about other specific aspects of the challenges about regarding Chinese investment in Africa. So that's a very first step after the GA. So thank you very much for your time for these discussions, very insightful. I would like also to extend my gratitude to all the technical and the technical staff of the Center for Human Rights, the translators. Thank you very much for making this happen. Last but not least, je voudrais également remercier l'ensemble de nos...
To thank all of members that have attended this webinar. I've seen a number of people that have been here. I would like also to seize this opportunity to thank a number of our partners that we have invited to join this webinar. Thank you for your presence, for the grace that you've given to us. This is the first meeting that we are having.
I'm also not forgetting the Secretariat team, Jenny, Liz, Coco. Thank you very much for everything. So I will now give back the floor to Maria, maybe for the concluding remarks. Maria.
Okay, there's another concluding remarks. I am sincerely grateful for the opportunity to moderate this webinar. It has really been very, very insightful. All the panelists have struck some points which are very provocative and thought provocative. And I think it's that calling again on our responsibilities as individuals, but collectively as an ACCA organization. Professor Jingjing put it very well. It's very unique in the manner the members that are coming from different countries, but also have different expertise within how they engage in all issues of investment. And they work with very diverse society. This is from women, persons with disabilities, very big corporations in rural areas, in urban settings, in periphery of the cities. So it's that niche which is within ACCA membership needs to be upgraded, sort of used in this interrelation on what Professor Jingjing and Sean is ready to bridge and see how best together we can move forward and really having an accountable investment in all these investments which are going between, Chinese and African. But also this cannot happen in vacuum. We have to honor that responsibility and we have to walk the talk. And walking the talk is not when just we meet in general assemblies. How do we relate with the Secretariat? How do we tap on these opportunities and really revelate the information to others to really see the impact our goals that we are putting to ourselves? And maybe I'm saying this because Dr. Sean put it rightly, there is no data. But if we question within ourselves as ACCA members, do we really look into how best we can even work together conclusively with Secretariat to have a platform which can be able to speak about these issues? So I think for me, this is just calling to members to harness the opportunity, but also to take our responsibilities as individually and collectively. Now we know what, and we have in place what the Chinese government have, and we know the challenges within the employers in the China, but the same is happening in African continent. So how can we bridge and move forward collectively? So thank you so much. Thank you, the team. Thank you, panelists, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm grateful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And have a good afternoon.
Yeah. Good evening. Bye.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Good day, Sean and
Bye.
Jingjing. Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.